welcome to Games as Lit 101. They're remaking Final Fantasy VII! Like many of my generation, Final Fantasy VII was the first RPG I ever played, and it absolutely astounded me. I played it late, so I was in high school and I had already seen far superior graphics and such, but the story, music, and world of the game grabbed me and didn't let go until the very end. I even hated turn-based combat before I played it, but not only did I suffer through the combat system for the story and characters, I ended up loving it by the time I finished. Back when Sony was still introducing us to the concept of the PS3, Square Enix did a tech demo for the upcoming system by recreating the opening cutscene of Final Fantasy VII with the PS3's graphical capabilities. This implied a planned remake, but they were quick to assure us they were planning nothing of the sort. Then they just kind of brought it up again and again to remind us they weren't going to do it. Until last week at E3 2015 when they announced that it is in the works and it's coming soon, which is why I decided to interrupt this show's normal schedule to talk about it.
At last, the promise has been made.
The prospect of remaking such a beloved, classic game begs a question. Just how faithful should it be? Video games have a strange relationship with remakes. I mean, at its heart, a remake is an adaptation, which means that part of the idea is to adapt the work to look at it from a bit of a different angle, or perhaps even just to update it to make it a bit more accessible to modern audiences. But video games, more often than not, have used remakes to copy the original game exactly as it was. Given that newer systems continuously release, making it difficult to legitimately play a game as it gets older, that makes a bit of sense, but the fervor with which gamers will demand that nothing is changed in their favorite game is kind of strange. Most video game remakes have been little more than re-releases, and the most change that usually occurs is a graphical overhaul, new music, and if applicable, a new translation. More games have recently begun rebooting old franchises with a bit more freedom, but this usually happens with once great franchises that have been floundering for a while, and it's still relatively rare compared to the number of beat-for-beat remakes. So if the Final Fantasy VII Remake is done in the same way as most video game remakes, it's gonna be basically identical to the original, aside of course from the updated visuals, orchestrated music, possibly voice acting, definitely a new translation. It's probably gonna have the same camera angles, it's gonna have the same gameplay mechanics, the same songs playing at the same times, all that stuff. But there's nothing really stopping them from taking a few risks and making a few changes. Well, I mean, you know, aside from the burning rage of the internet if they do, at least. But we have to consider what the purpose of this remake will be. It's easy to pass off something like this as pure nostalgia, and people who don't really see any value in remakes are probably going to do so, but as I've mentioned in my episodes on adaptation and preservation, there is a bit more to it than that. And to figure out what, in this case, I think we're going to need a pretty solid grasp of the legacy of the original game, as well as what elements of it could really benefit from an update. Like it or not, Final Fantasy VII is one of the most influential video games ever made. But video games have come a long way in a short time, and this remake is coming out in celebration of the original's 20th anniversary. So, as you can imagine, the original hasn't aged all that well visually. The art and style are still quite excellent, of course, but it still doesn't look detailed or realistic enough for modern audiences to easily appreciate it, especially a younger generation that's growing up on frantic action games and uber-realistic graphics. And to be fair, these stubby things with blocks for hands were never the greatest character sprites to begin with. And while we certainly should be able to appreciate games regardless of their polygon count, and honestly I think the original Final Fantasy VII actually holds up quite well despite its evident age, the spectacle of Final Fantasy VII is nothing to be underestimated. My generation was fairly young when we first played it, when it was released, and kids often have trouble really enjoying turn-based battle systems, but the grandeur of the story and setting, much of which was communicated through some impressive visuals for the time, was enough reason to keep going. And honestly, I think that's part of the reason the game became such a formative work for so many people. The audio sounds quite outdated, of course, since this game was made long before a soundtrack this huge would be able to fit on the game as anything other than synthesized tracks. But now it could be fully orchestrated. The soundtracks are no doubt going to be quite improved, and I'm sure the game could even be fully voiced without issue at this point. Assuming at least that we're willing to give up the ability to rename our characters whatever we want, which honestly would be a really good trade-off. These characters are so iconic that that's kind of weird in this case, and honestly it's kind of a strange practice anyway. The gameplay is of a classic turn-based variety, or more specifically Square's active time battle system, and utilizes some old concepts like random encounters. But if Square Enix actually learned anything from the success of Bravely Default, it's that this kind of old-school gameplay is not a bad thing. We can also look to the criminally overlooked Lost Odyssey as an example of how such a system can still work well in the modern age and with HD graphics. So I don't think the base gameplay mechanics actually need to change in any major way, though they definitely should redo all the mini-games from the ground up. If I have to race chocobos again, I at least want it to suck less this time. Ultimately, what really captured the imaginations of so many people were the story and characters, and honestly, I don't think they need any updating, not from a cultural standpoint at least. Despite a few stereotypes, as well as a poor translation that will no doubt be updated, the characters and scenario of Final Fantasy VII are kind of timeless. The setting is a weird mix of fantasy and sci-fi that's clearly a world apart from our own. The world is developed enough that we gain a solid grasp on it without needing to be aware of any particular real-life culture, and the characters are fleshed out and don't really need any extra context. And the story, while famously complicated, generally comes together quite well, and taken as a whole, it's a beautiful story about grief, loss, and the meaning people have even after they leave your life. But I have to save some stuff for my eventual, inevitable analysis of the game, so I'll stop talking about the story now. So I think the only areas in which Final Fantasy VII has any real disconnect from our culture right now are the visuals, the audio, and the dialogue, which was really just a victim of the poor translation efforts at the time. So, is it worth just updating those elements of the game and presenting Final Fantasy VII as we already know it, but shinier, sleeker, and newer to a new generation of players? Or should the team over at Square Enix try and update things and put a new spin on the game? I definitely think we shouldn't hold nostalgic things quite as sacred as we tend to. I mean, no matter what this game does, even if it messes up the story, or just changes it somehow, or even just royally screws up the entire game, it will not ruin the original. It can't. We have the original, and there is nothing that this game can do to take that away from us. And, you know, it might be kind of interesting to see a new take on this classic game. That said, what we have here is an opportunity to give new players who grew up in a very different video game industry than we did, the opportunity to experience one of the most influential and beloved video games ever made in a way that's far more accessible to them. I mean, as much as I and all the other fans of the game are very excited to experience it remade, this isn't about us. We're not the ones with whom this remake could have lasting importance. That's new players, people who missed this important entry in video game history, kids who grew up in the age of samey multiplayer shooters and drab brown action games, anyone who hasn't had a good opportunity to experience the wonder, the excitement, the tears, the epic and memorable experience this game gave us. I am incredibly excited to relive Final Fantasy VII in a whole new light. But I'm even more excited for the opportunity for the game to meet people where they are, and hopefully enchant a whole new generation of gamers the same way it enchanted mine. And see, that's what's important here, not just how nostalgic it makes us feel. And to do that, this remake has to update the game. Give it a voice cast, a new translation, orchestrated music, and of course gorgeous HD graphics. But any changes that are made should stay true to the spirit of the experience of Final Fantasy VII. So, I'm on the side of faithfulness here. I mean, yes, update it, absolutely. Make it more palatable to modern audiences, but give those audiences a new avenue to this classic experience, not just a completely new one. So do you think this remake should be as faithful as possible, or should the team over at Square Enix tinker with the story and mechanics a bit to make it a truly reimagined experience? Go ahead and hash it out respectfully in the comments, and don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, etc. down in the description. Check out that Patreon link too. Next week, it's back to our regularly scheduled programming with our examination of player choice in Life is Strange. So, until then, class dismissed.